It started like any other day. I parked my car in front of my house, as I often do when I need to load or unload items. It was a convenient spot, right at the edge of my driveway. I wasn't in anyone else's way, and I planned to move the car shortly after. Little did I know, this routine act would spark a chain of events I couldn't have imagined. I noticed a car slowly driving past, and for a moment I thought it might be someone looking for an address or a friend stopping by. Instead, it was a neighbor from the Homeowners Association, HOA board. They gave me a long, scrutinizing look before driving off. At the time, I brushed it off, assuming it wasn't a big deal. Later, I went inside to continue my day, completely unaware of the brewing storm. About an hour passed when I heard a knock at the door. Opening it, I was met by a police officer standing on my porch. My heart raced slightly. It's not every day the police show up unannounced. The officer explained that there had been a complaint about my car blocking the driveway. Confused, I told him it was my driveway and my car. Surely this was a misunderstanding, right? But his tone made it clear this wasn't just a casual check-in. I stepped outside with him, pointing to my car and explaining the situation. The officer seemed slightly embarrassed, but informed me that he was obligated to follow up due to the HOA's report. As frustrating as it was, I complied, moving my car just to avoid further hassle. What struck me was the absurdity of it all. Who would call the police over something so trivial? Even more baffling was that it happened on my own property. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. By the time I returned inside, my mind was racing with questions. What rules could I have possibly broken? And why did this neighbor feel the need to escalate such a minor issue to law enforcement? Living under an HOA comes with its perks, or so they say. Supposedly, it maintains the neighborhood's appeal and property values. But for me, it often felt like living under constant surveillance. There was always someone watching, ready to pounce on any minor infraction. The HOA in my neighborhood was particularly notorious. Stories circulated about petty fines and bizarre rules. One family was fined for their holiday lights being too bright, while another received a notice for leaving their trash out 5 minutes past the collection time. These tales made me wonder if this organization truly existed to serve the community or just to wield power. My situation wasn't the first time I'd felt targeted. Over the years, I'd received several notices about minor issues like the length of my grass or the placement of a flower pot. While I complied to avoid trouble, I couldn't shake the feeling of being unfairly singled out. This latest incident, however, felt like a new low. Calling the police over my car in front of my house? It seemed absurd, even for them. But this wasn't just about the inconvenience, it was about control. The HOA board seemed to thrive on nitpicking, enforcing arbitrary rules while ignoring larger community issues. Streets were riddled with potholes, but heaven forbid someone paint their mailbox the wrong shade of white. I began to question their true motives. Were they genuinely concerned about the neighborhood? Or was this about ego and power? It felt more like the latter. This sense of surveillance created a tense atmosphere in the neighborhood. No one wanted to step out of line, fearing the wrath of the board. People whispered about the latest HOA drama, but few dared to challenge them outright. For me, this incident was a tipping point. I wasn't going to let them bully me over something so trivial. But I knew standing up to the HOA wouldn't be easy. The moment the police showed up at my door, everything changed. What should have been a mundane day quickly spiraled into something surreal. As I stood there talking to the officer, a mix of anger and disbelief bubbled inside me. The officer, to his credit, seemed uncomfortable. He admitted this wasn't the type of call they wanted to handle, but explained that the HOA had insisted. They claimed my car was obstructing access and demanded action. I couldn't believe it. My car wasn't blocking anyone. It wasn't even on the sidewalk. It was firmly parked in front of my driveway, on my property. The idea that this warranted a police visit was laughable, if it wasn't happening to me. After moving the car, I asked the officer if there was any official violation or fine. He said no, not from the city or police department. This was purely an HOA issue. That only added to my frustration. The officer left, apologizing for the inconvenience, but I was left fuming. This wasn't about legality or safety. It was about harassment. The HOA was using their influence to intimidate me, and I refused to let them get away with it. It became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a pattern. The HOA had taken similar actions against others, using fear and fines to assert their dominance. I decided right then that I wasn't going to back down. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. This wasn't just about me. It was about standing up for fairness and common sense. A few days later, I received the letter. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA, informing me that I was being fined for obstructing access to the driveway. The fine was hefty, far more than I expected. I stared at the letter in disbelief. This was my driveway, my car, and my property. How could I possibly be obstructing access to something I owned? The logic was non-existent, and yet the consequences were real. I contacted the HOA to dispute the fine, but their response was cold and dismissive. They cited a vague rule about maintaining access for emergency vehicles and refused to back down. It was infuriating. This wasn't just about the money. It was about principle. I couldn't let them get away with such blatant overreach. But fighting back wouldn't be easy. The HOA had their own lawyers and a system designed to wear people down. Still, I refused to give up. I began researching HOA laws and reaching out to other homeowners who'd faced similar issues. Slowly, I started building a case. This wasn't just a fight for my driveway. It was a stand against the abuse of power. If no one challenged the HOA, they'd continue to trample over residents with impunity. The situation began to take a toll. I spent hours drafting letters, gathering evidence, and preparing for the battle ahead. But the more I learned, the more determined I became. The HOA seemed less interested in maintaining harmony and more focused on creating traps for homeowners. Every rule came with the threat of fines or worse, as if the neighborhood were some dystopian simulation. People would joke about it, but the truth was less amusing. These absurd rules kept everyone on edge, afraid of accidentally crossing an invisible line. I began digging into the HOA's handbook, curious to see if they had overstepped their authority. To my surprise, the rule about blocking driveways was buried in vague language, with no specific examples or clarifications. It was essentially a catch-all clause, designed to be interpreted however they saw fit. This wasn't just unfair, it was outright manipulative. The more I researched, the more ridiculous it seemed. Other communities had similar horror stories. People fined for having mismatched flower pots, kids' chalk drawings being called graffiti, and one man who was penalized for a fence that was 2 inches too high. The HOA had essentially turned their power into a weapon. What struck me most was the inconsistency. Some rules were strictly enforced, while others were completely ignored. For example, one neighbor's lawn was overgrown for weeks, but they never received a single warning. Meanwhile, I was being punished for parking on my own property. It became clear that this wasn't about fairness or order, it was about control. The HOA seemed to thrive on making residents feel powerless, using fines and threats as their tools. It wasn't just my fight anymore, it was about standing up for everyone who had been bullied by these organizations. Determined to make a difference, I decided to share my story with others. I spoke to neighbors, attended HOA meetings, and even began documenting every interaction I had with them. If they wanted to play hardball, I was ready to fight back with facts and community support. This wasn't just about my driveway. It was about exposing the hypocrisy and holding them accountable. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. After the incident with the HOA, I wondered if I was the only one experiencing this level of scrutiny. Had others in the neighborhood been targeted, or was I just an unlucky exception? I decided to test the waters and talk to my neighbors about their experiences. To my surprise, many of them shared similar stories. One neighbor recounted how they'd been fined for leaving their car window slightly open overnight, while another was penalized for a non-regulation basketball hoop their kids played with in their own driveway. These stories painted a picture of an HOA more concerned with nitpicking than fostering community spirit. However, not everyone was willing to speak up. Several neighbors admitted they were afraid of retaliation. They didn't want to make waves, fearing the HOA would escalate their enforcement if they dared to push back. This silence spoke volumes about the power imbalance in our neighborhood. I quickly realized that this wasn't just about rules. It was about control through intimidation. The HOA relied on fear to maintain their grip, ensuring that most residents would rather pay a fine than risk a prolonged battle. This dynamic had created a culture of compliance, where few dared to question the status quo. Despite the fear, a handful of neighbors expressed support for my efforts. They thanked me for standing up to the HOA, even if they weren't ready to join the fight themselves. Their words were encouraging and reminded me that I wasn't alone. The conversations also uncovered a troubling trend: selective enforcement. Many neighbors noticed that certain residents, often those on friendly terms with the board, seemed to receive leniency, while others bore the brunt of the HOA's rules. This double standard added fuel to my determination to challenge their authority. With this newfound insight, I felt more prepared to take action. The HOA wasn't invincible, and their tactics could only succeed if everyone stayed silent. I knew that exposing their unfair practices could inspire others to stand up as well. The question now was how far I was willing to go. Would I keep it civil, or was it time to escalate my approach? As I delved deeper into the HOA's operations, it became clear that the system wasn't built for fairness. From vague rules to arbitrary enforcement, everything seemed designed to favor the board's authority over the homeowner's rights. The HOA meetings I attended only reinforced this belief. Decisions were often made behind closed doors, with little transparency or input from residents. When questions were raised, board members either deflected or dismissed concerns outright. It felt less like a democratic process and more like an autocracy. One of the most frustrating aspects was the appeals process. If you disagreed with a fine or rule, you had to file a formal complaint, attend a hearing, and present your case. This might sound fair in theory, but in practice, it was a nightmare. The board acted as judge, jury, and executioner, rarely overturning their own decisions. Adding insult to injury, many HOAs require homeowners to pay the fines up front, even if they plan to dispute them. This policy essentially punished people for seeking justice, forcing them to choose between financial strain and standing up for their rights. It became clear that the system was intentionally designed to discourage resistance. By making the process as tedious and costly as possible, the HOA ensured that most residents would simply comply, even if they felt wronged. I began to question how such an unfair system could exist in the first place. Research revealed that many HOAs are governed by outdated laws and contracts that heavily favor the boards. Reforming these systems would require significant legal and community efforts, which most people lack the time or resources to pursue. Despite the challenges, I wasn't ready to give up. This fight wasn't just about my driveway anymore. It was about challenging a broken system and shining a light on the injustices that so many homeowners faced. With my research complete and my frustration boiling over, I decided it was time to confront the HOA directly. Armed with evidence of their inconsistencies and selective enforcement, I prepared for what I knew would be a tense encounter. The next HOA meeting was my first opportunity. I arrived early, determined to make my voice heard. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as other homeowners whispered about the latest rules and fines. It was clear that many shared my frustrations but lacked the confidence to speak out. When the time came, I stood up and addressed the board. I presented my case, highlighting the absurdity of being fined for parking in my own driveway. I also pointed out the double standards in their enforcement and questioned the validity of their rules. As expected, the board members weren't pleased. They tried to deflect my points, claiming that the rules were in place for the good of the community. But their vague responses only strengthened my resolve. It was clear they didn't have solid answers, just excuses. Other residents began to chime in, sharing their own grievances. The room quickly turned into a forum for long-suppressed frustrations, with people voicing their anger at the board's overreach. For the first time, I felt a sense of unity in our neighborhood. While the meeting didn't result in immediate change, it was a crucial first step. The board now knew they couldn't operate without scrutiny, and the residents realized they had the power to challenge the status quo. It was a small victory, but it gave me hope. If we could keep this momentum going, we might finally be able to hold the HOA accountable. HOAs were created with good intentions, but somewhere along the way, the power seemed to corrupt. Instead of protecting communities, many boards became focused on control and authority, often at the expense of the residents they were supposed to serve. My HOA was no exception. Their obsession with micromanaging every aspect of the neighborhood had turned what should have been a supportive community into a minefield of rules and fines. They seemed to relish their power, using it to enforce petty rules and punish anyone who dared to step out of line. One board member in particular, Mr. Andrews, epitomized this power trip. Known for his rigid demeanor and unyielding approach, he was often the one spearheading the harshest policies. It was clear he enjoyed wielding authority, even if it alienated the very people he was supposed to represent. This misuse of power wasn't just frustrating, it was harmful. It created an environment of fear and resentment, where neighbors saw each other as potential informants rather than allies. The HOA had turned what should have been a community into a battleground. After months of fighting, the situation finally reached a resolution. The HOA was forced to review their policies and revise some of their more absurd rules. While they didn't admit wrongdoing, the changes were a step in the right direction. But more importantly, the experience taught me valuable lessons about standing up for what's right. HOAs only have as much power as residents allow them to have. By staying informed and united, homeowners can challenge unfair practices and push for change.